Thanks very much, Svenja. Thank you, everybody. And apologies to the community woodland people who thought they were going to do something far more interesting, but have found themselves forced into this instead. But thank you. As Theresa May would say, it's great to be back in Edinburgh. One of the questions I get asked most often is why don't I despair? Given that my job basically consists of rolling in the excrement of humanity, and I'm not just talking about my recent encounter with Piers Morgan, how is it that that I don't just find it all overwhelming? And well, sometimes I do, especially on the environmental side. I sometimes find it just all a bit too much. But the thing that keeps me going is the recognition that political failure is at heart a failure of imagination. If you're staring at the brick wall and you're failing to perceive a crack in that wall, it's because you're not looking at it right. There's always going to be a crack. You just have to look from the right angle, in the right light, and you will find it. And this perception has been enhanced for me by 4 observations that I've made with the help of friends over the past couple of years, and which have informed this new daft book that I've written. And I can't claim they're original. I don't know. I mean, I know that at least one of them is not. Whether the others are or not, I've no idea. But it's these 4 have kind of recharged my belief that we have a future, and perhaps an exciting future at that. The first of these observations is that it is not political leaders or political parties who run the world and change the world. It is big political narratives. Over the past 70 years or so, the world has been governed by 2 narratives, first one and then the other. And it more or less divides in half that 70 years. And the first half of that period, the dominant narrative was Keynesian social democracy, which said that we'll distribute wealth through high taxation on those people who have got a lot of it, spread it around society through paying for robust public services and a strong social safety net. And in spending that money into the economy, we stimulate more employment, which stimulates more consumption, which then stimulates further employment and a steady rate of economic growth. That's what Keynesianism is. And during the period when it was dominant, it swept the political board. It didn't matter whether you were Labour or Conservative, whether you were Democratic or Republican. It didn't matter what the history of your party was, what your own standing was, what your colour was, what your name was. Everyone was a Keynesian. As Richard Nixon is believed to have said, we are all Keynesians now. It became the common sense. It was what everybody believed. If you didn't go along with that agenda, you had some answers to provide, because people would say, why are you going against this? It's just common sense. And then when Keynesianism ran into trouble in the late 1970s, this new doctrine, neoliberalism, swept in instead. It had been developed for the past 30 or 40 years, starting with the work of people like Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, picked up by people like Milton Friedman, and pushed out through this sort of international network funded by exceedingly rich people of think tanks and academic departments with journalists, government advisors and the rest of it, building up this completely different doctrine, which said that human relations should be conceived as a market. Human society should be seen as a market, and our relationships should be seen as commercial transactions. And in engaging with each other through buying and selling, we determine a natural hierarchy of who the winners should be and who the losers should be. And you can tell who the winners are because they've got money, and you can tell who the losers are because they haven't. And that's the way it should be. And anything which attempts to interfere with that development of the natural hierarchy will impoverish and crush society and ensure that the wrong people come out on top. So there should be no trade unions. There should be no taxation except a minimal amount and a flat tax which everybody has to pay. There should be no regulation. There should be no involvement of government in changing social outcomes of any kind. There should be, in effect, no civic life. The market will sort it all out through the magical workings of the invisible hand. And crazy as this doctrine sounds, and crazy as indeed it was, it swept the board. Most people didn't have a name for it. They had no idea what was happening. They called it Thatcherism or Reaganism or monetarism or libertarianism or laissez-faire economics. But the name neoliberalism is the name which its founders gave to it at the beginning and then buried. Because in common with a lot of hegemonic power, if you don't identify it, you can't fight it. As Alistair McIntosh, one of the founders of the Centre for Human Ecology, and its one of its leading lights, is fond of pointing out, the theologian Walter Wink identifies naming the powers as the first step towards confronting the powers. And we have been tongue-tied about this. It's been too big to see. And even when we see it, we shy away from confronting it, from even giving it a name. It is called neoliberalism, and we should continue to use that name. And when that became dominant, it too swept the board. For a while, the old social democratic parties, like Labour and like the Democrats, held out a bit against it and said, well, okay, you know, we understand we've got to change a bit, but we're going to hold on to some Keynesian social democracy. And I know we'll resolve this through triangulation. We'll have a bit of the old stuff and a bit of the new stuff, and we'll position ourselves in the middle, a third way triangulation. Well, it wasn't long before they became lost in their Bermuda triangulation. The dying star of Keynesianism was no match for the gravitational pull of this new, highly virulent, highly effective ideology which had come in, and before long, everyone in mainstream politics was a neoliberal. Neoliberalism swept the board. It became the new common sense, regardless of colour, regardless of origins, etc., etc. It is the big political stories that change the world. And there shouldn't be anything surprising about this when we understand where we stand in relation to understanding the world. We understand where we stand in relation to understanding. That is a mouthful. When we look at how we navigate the world. If we try to make sense of the world in the mathematical sense or the scientific sense, the philosophical sense, we immediately become overwhelmed by it. If we try to say, right, where do I stand? Let's look at the data, let's look at the facts and the figures. You just can't cope with that. You can't compute it. The world is too complex. It has always been too complex. So we use a heuristic, we use a shortcut to try to understand the world, and that shortcut is the story. We are creatures of narrative. We have an innate disposition towards hearing stories, towards looking out for them, towards understanding how they place us in the world, tell us how we got there, where we are, the future might hold. And so when we try to make sense of things, the sense we're seeking is not the sense that a scientist might recognize, it is narrative sense. Are we hearing a story which makes narrative sense? Is there narrative fidelity here? Does it progress as we would expect a story to progress? Is there a beginning and a middle and an end? Is there a hero, and does the hero triumph? These are the sort of things that we're looking out for when we're trying to make sense of where we stand in the world. So that was the first observation, that it's the stories that run the world, in effect. Second observation is perhaps slightly more interesting. And it is as follows, that though Keynesian social democracy and neoliberalism are diametrically opposed to each other, they use the same narrative structure. So the Keynesian story goes as follows. Well, sorry, I'd better explain the narrative structure first. The narrative structure is what I call the restoration story. And it goes like this. It's, disorder afflicts the land, caused by powerful and nefarious forces working against the good of humanity. But the hero of the story, who might be one person or a group of people or an institution, confronts those powerful and nefarious forces, and against the odds overthrows them and restores order to the land. So the Keynesian social democratic story goes as follows. Disorder afflicts the land, caused by these powerful, nefarious forces of the economic elite, which, by concentrating enormous power over the 19th century and the early 20th century, basically excluded and impoverished everybody else, gathered up the wealth for itself in the form of patrimonial capital, capital which multiplies from one generation to the next, whereas other people are progressively impoverished and progressively deprived of political power because they are deprived of economic power. And this system would inevitably lead to crisis because of the deprivation of most of the people of the land of economic power, which meant that eventually the market for goods and services collapses, as it did in the form of the Great Depression. But the hero of the story, the enabling state, supported by the working and the middle classes, confronts these powerful and nefarious forces and overthrows them through the high taxation of patrimonial capital. Taxes, as you know, went up to 98% at one point in this country to basically break the power of patrimonial capital, the redistribution in the form of public services, social safety net, and the stimulus to the economy that this creates, which brought order back to the land, which restored the land to order. That's a Keynesian social democratic story. The neoliberal story says, disorder afflicts the land, caused by the powerful and nefarious force of the centralized, oppressive, collectivizing state, which taxes the rich and takes away their rightful property and spends it on trying to change social outcomes and to put the wrong people in charge, and in doing so crushes freedom and opportunity and individualism. But the hero of the story, the freedom-seeking entrepreneur, takes on this powerful and nefarious force, and against the odds overthrows it and restores order to the land by creating a market economy in which you can pursue your freedom and pursue your opportunity as you wish. Two starkly opposed stories with the same narrative structure. And this led to the third observation, which is that this narrative structure, the restoration story, is common to successful political and religious revolutions across history, across centuries and across millennia. It is a story we are ready to hear, and it is a story that has worked again and again in politics and religion. And this led to the fourth observation, which is that the reason we are stuck with neoliberalism, despite its multiple and manifest failures, financial failure, economic failure, political failure, social failure, cultural failure, above all environmental failure, is that we have produced no new restoration story with which to replace it. The only thing that can displace a story is a story. If you throw facts and figures at a story, they're just going to bounce straight off. I've seen this often enough with climate change deniers. People who've got a story, they say this nefarious force of these so-called climate scientists have invented this thing just to tax us and regulate us and suppress us and destroy our freedom. And it's all complete rubbish and they've made it all up. And you say, well, that's not strictly true, because if you see this paper in Geophysical Research Letters, it's got the following data. All you're going to get is reactive denial back, is anger back, because you're confronting a story with facts and figures. It does not work. You cannot take away someone's story without giving them a new one. Well, some of you might say, well, why don't we just bring back Keynesian social democracy? I mean, that worked very well, didn't it? And it did. For about 30 years, it worked supremely well in what the French call the Trente Glorieuses, 1945 to 1975. And it did exactly what it said on the tin. It did what it was supposed to do, and it was highly successful. There are three reasons, I believe, why we can't bring it back today. The first one is that it's very hard to go back to politics unless, bizarrely, you're a fascist. I don't know why this is. Fascism seems to keep going back and keep digging up the same story, and it keeps working, sadly, and terrifyingly, as we see at the moment in many countries. But other politics, no. And I think maybe the principal reason is that they come under sustained attack by people who object to that politics, who eventually find the ways of destroying it and the flaws in it. And this leads to the second reason why it's not going to work, is that they found the ways of destroying it. Global finance launched highly effective attacks on the Keynesian model leading up to the 1970s, principally by pulling down capital controls, which were essential for its functioning, by attacking fixed foreign exchange rates, and by stymieing Keynes's plans for a balanced global trading system. Basically, if you've got porous financial borders and don't have capital controls, don't have fixed foreign exchange rates, you pull those Keynesian stimulus levers and put money into the economy expecting it to stimulate work and employment and income and the rest of it, and you're stimulating it in China, not in the UK. It's very hard to make it work. And we cannot expect that the highly effective strategies that global finance deployed in the 20th century will have been forgotten. They will just do it again. But the third reason is by far the most important reason. And that is that the Keynesian model relies on sustaining a steady rate of economic growth. That's what the stimulus spending is for. It's bringing an economy back to growth, and you don't want it to get too far. There's some dampening mechanisms there as well, but you want to sustain a steady rate of growth, which would be just fine if the planet were growing. But we live in a world of fixed dimensions. It does not grow. And when the economy grows within a finite planet and keeps growing and keeps growing and keeps growing, it eventually bursts through environmental limits. And we're seeing that process happening right now. How many people saw the recent data on insect decline? Just an extraordinary thing. I mean, we're talking about 75% of insects disappearing in one generation. One human generation, that is, not one insect generation. That would be even worse. But this extraordinary collapse just taking place in front of our own eyes. You know, those of you who are as young as I am will remember, the moth snowstorm, as Michael McCarthy calls it, with you're going in your parents' car down the country road, and it's just like a blizzard of moths. Nowadays, you can drive across the whole country, and there's not a single insect on your windscreen or your headlights. There's just nothing left. It's amazing what's happened. We see soil disappearing at such a rate that, according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, we have 60 years of harvests left. Already 20% of the world's croplands have declining productivity because of the loss of their soil. This is an even more rapid and imminent catastrophe than the climate catastrophe that we're talking about here. I mean, it's staggering speed is taking place. And incidentally, the sort of leading light of neoliberalism, Friedrich Hayek, says in the Constitution of Liberty that we should mine the soil, we should extract value from the soil as quickly as possible, turn it into capital, and then we can reinvest it in something else. We shouldn't make any distinction between what he thinks of as natural capital and other forms of capital like machinery. He doesn't explain what happens when everybody mines the soil and there's no soil left. But if anyone's read or seen The Road, you get a fairly good idea of that. Then, of course, there's climate breakdown. I don't call it climate change. That's a bit like calling a foreign invasion unexpected visitors. And it's such a preposterously neutral and mild term for the existential crisis that we face with climate breakdown. We're seeing the bursting of those environmental boundaries happening right now, and it is driven primarily by economic growth. We might call it consumerism, but consumerism is the necessary component of economic growth. You can't have economic growth unless those who have got money to spend keep on spending it and spending it and spending it, even when their needs have been met, their strong desires have been met, and their weak desires have been met. This is why you have to sell them things like video phones for pets, so you can talk to your pet when you're away from home. I'm not making this up. A smart egg tray which sends a message to your mobile phone when the eggs are running out in your fridge. So, seriously, a watermelon cooler which you can pull along to picnics. It only weighs about 20 kilos or so. It's very convenient, and you can pull it along to keep your watermelon cool. You have to keep producing junk like that, because otherwise the whole system stalls, grinds to a halt, collapses. The system is premised on collapse, because if it stops growing, you get economic collapse, and if it keeps growing, you get environmental collapse. And that measurement of progress, gross domestic product, GDP, is a measurement of progress towards ruin. It's not going to work. We can't go back to the Keynesian model. So all we need is a new restoration story that's positive, that's propositional, that tells us who we are, where we're going to go, that has that nice narrative structure which seems to work, and that is based on fact rather than the complete bollocks that neoliberalism was based on. It sounds like a bit of a tall order, doesn't it? Where on earth can such a story come from? Well, it's my contention that there's a story just waiting to be told. And here, in broad outline, it is. Over the past 20 years or so, there's been a remarkable convergence of findings in a whole lot of different disciplines, in neuroscience, in psychology, in anthropology, in evolutionary biology, all pointing towards the same very striking conclusion, which, in the words of a paper in Frontiers of Psychology, is that human beings are spectacularly unusual when compared to other animals. Well, we are in all sorts of ways, but in this case, they're talking about altruism. Altruism? Human beings, you've got to be kidding. Look at what we do. Look at what we do to each other. Look at what we do to the living world. Look at what we do to future generations. How can you say we're altruistic? This is a crazy thing. And sure, you know, if you look at the people who take over, the people who get to the top, yeah, you know, it's generally the selfishest, the most selfish, the most greedy, grasping people seem to come to the top. There's something a bit, you know, wrong with us in that we allow people who don't share our values to dominate. And so we see them and say, well, that's what human beings are like. They're on the news all the time, so you see them. We have another tendency, which is to look out for danger. So the bad behavior of people who might do us in, that's salient in our minds, and that tendency is greatly reinforced by the news media, because as we know, if it bleeds, it leads. And so we're always being confronted with the really bad things that people do. But the people who do those really bad things are in a very, very small minority. They exist, but there's a tiny number of them. And the great majority of people aren't like that. In test after test, experiment after experiment, survey after survey, what we see is that the values of empathy, of connectedness, of benevolence are right up there at the top of our value list. And sure, there's selfishness and greed, there's a bit of that in all of us, but it's way down here by comparison. It's the opposite of the story which economists have been telling us for a very long time. And economists are a strange breed, not all of them by any means, but there's some very interesting work showing that as your economics degree progresses, you become more and more selfish and greedy. Because basically it's this sort of mainstream economics as taught in departments today is a kind of fundamentalist church of selfishness and greed. Anyway, economists have this model of humankind that they call Homo economicus. It sounds very scientific because it's in Latin, which is self-maximizing man, and it's always, the picture is always of a man, and this man is just pursuing self-interest. You're pursuing as much wealth and power as you can possibly grab, and they use this as their modeling tool for saying, right, well, how will humans behave if we make this economic change or that economic change? It's got no basis at all in how we behave, but this is how they see it. And there's a very interesting paper in a psychology journal which says that Homo economicus is an excellent description of chimpanzees. It's basically how chimpanzees behave. If you get some really interesting food, you're a chimpanzee, you will guard it and eat the whole lot yourself if you can. If even your own infant comes and begs you for some, you'll threaten them and chase them away. If a stranger chimpanzee turns up in a troop of chimpanzees and says, "Hi guys, come to join you, see what's going on," they're highly likely literally to have their arms torn off. Now here's a group of people, not all of whom know each other. How many of you have had your arms torn off? If you have, could you ask your neighbour to hold up your hand? This is an extraordinary thing. Just the fact that you are sitting here peacefully. No one started a fight yet. We'll see how things progress, but hasn't happened yet. We're sitting here peacefully, yet most of us are not related to each other. In any other large, intelligent mammal, see that happening, this is going to be, it just doesn't happen like that. It doesn't work like that. When you came in here, did you barge your way past everybody else, knocking people flying in order to get the best seat? Or did you, let others stand aside a little bit, let people walk ahead if need be? If there was someone a bit frailer than you were, maybe you even helped them find their seat. Maybe you even stood aside for them. This goes way beyond reciprocity. When you give money to a homeless person, you don't expect that person to pay you back at some point. When you send money to a cause on the other side of the world, you don't expect to get money back from that cause. This is a generalized, far higher level of altruism than simple reciprocity. And it goes, and while we have these mundane examples all around us, so common that we don't even notice them, it goes to extraordinary lengths in some cases. My Dutch mother-in-law's family, during the German occupation, the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, kept in their house a 6-year-old Jewish boy, fed him and everything as well, who was a total stranger to them. They just took him in. He was passed to them through the resistance. They kept him in their house for 2 years. The next door house was occupied by the local German commandant. The streets were swarming with soldiers and officials at all times of the day and night. Had they been caught, the whole lot would have been sent to Auschwitz and murdered. There were thousands of Dutch families doing this. There were thousands of families across occupied Europe doing this. There are people today taking refugees into their homes in this country and treating them as family members. These are spectacular examples of altruism. This is what we are like. But disorder afflicts the land. Our good nature has been thwarted by powerful and nefarious forces. Now, it's always been the case that it's hard for us fully to express that good nature, that altruism, that empathy, that community-mindedness, that benevolence. There's always been something which has made it hard. But the circumstances created by the dominant ideology, the ideology which dominates almost every aspect of our lives, neoliberalism, make it, in some respects, harder almost than at any time before. Because what neoliberalism says first is that our dominant characteristics are indeed selfishness and greed. There's no scientific evidence for this whatsoever. They don't even try to advance any scientific evidence. They just say that's the way it is. And this is constantly reproduced in subtle ways by the media, the billionaire press and other parts of the media. And they say not only is that are those our dominant characteristics, but it's a good thing that those are our dominant characteristics, because it's those which make us competitive and individualistic. And by being competitive and individualistic, we establish that natural hierarchy of winners and losers. We ensure that some people become supremely rich, and their wealth will trickle down to enrich everybody. Don't we know how well that works? And we are constantly, in obvious and subtle ways, bombarded with this message that we are indeed selfish and greedy people. We stand alone, and that we ought to stand alone. And that when you confront a problem of any kind, of any scale, it is you and you alone who must deal with that problem if it hasn't already been magically dealt with by the invisible hand of the market. So if there is structural unemployment and you are unemployed, It's nothing to do with structural unemployment. It's to do with you being feckless and lazy. And we absorb and internalize this and reproduce it. And just as the rich tell themselves, well, I'm rich because I'm deserving, I have merit, forgetting the fact that they inherited their money from their parents, like a certain D. Trump, the poor also tell themselves in subtle ways that it's their fault that they're in their position. You're so often told, you're a shirker, you're a scrounger, you're this, you're that, you're lazy, you're unenterprising, that you begin to absorb it. And there have been surveys of people who are on social security identifying people on social security as scroungers. Not me, obviously, but those other people on social security are scroungers and benefit frauds and all the rest of it. Because you're just constantly getting it from the Daily Mail and the Express and the Sun and all the rest of it, and then and you eventually suck it up and you vomit it out. It becomes this internalized and reproduced discourse. And what this leads to is a whole series of issues which can be summarized as alienation, being separated from each other, that's the whole point, separated from the living world, separated from our labor, and above all, separated from ourselves. All the crises of neoliberalism converge into psychic rupture. And we see throughout society levels of distress, of mental health disorders, of alcoholism, drug abuse, whatever it might be, basically driven by this belief that we have to confront these problems that are far bigger than ourselves alone, that we should be alone, that it's a truncation of our social minds. We are, above all else, a socially minded species, which means that our minds do not stop at the boundary of our body. They're not confined to our own brains, to our own bodies. Our minds don't make any sense unless they're mingled and networked with other people's minds. This is why solitary confinement is such an effective form of torture. This is why, after a certain period in solitary confinement, you will lose your mind. Because it's not just your mind, it's our mind. It's a collective mind, which is our mind. You can't separate the two things, and if you do, it's like guillotining your mind down the middle, and you become just half the person that you need to be whole. And so we find ourselves thrown into disorder, and which is a way of saying the land is thrown into disorder. Our good nature has been thwarted, our happiness, our well-being, our prosperity has been thwarted, alongside the environmental crisis and all the other crises that we face. But we, the heroes of this story, are going to fight back and going to overthrow these powerful and nefarious forces, and we are going to do so by the polar opposite of alienation, which is belonging. And the story I'm telling here is what I call the politics of belonging. And it has to start, well, really from both ends, from the bottom up, but also from the top down, the shifts which I'm going to propose. Now, the good thing about these two words, belonging and community, is that almost anyone, wherever they're placed on the political spectrum, accepts those as good things. Belonging, community, how can you argue against them? And so even the most extreme people who got sort of really ungenerous and exclusive politics have to pay lip service to them. Very interesting, if you Edmund Burke's famous quote about the little platoons, the local community being the basis of politics, Thomas Paine said something almost identical, even though they're as far apart on the political spectrum as you could possibly get. So at least, even if we don't mean quite the same thing by it, we start with a common language, and this is crucially important, because especially nowadays where almost anyone could be seen as a floating voter, you know, people who might be following some fascist demagogue today might have been Labour voters just a few years ago and might be Labour voters again in a couple of years. You know, we can pull people round, we can turn them round because the old loyalties have shattered. There are openings here for reaching people nowadays, which weren't there before. So we have to start with a common language. And community and belonging is a good common language with which to begin. The second thing to say is that unless we produce a politics of belonging and real generous and inclusive communities, the alternative is not no community and no belonging, because everybody seeks those. This is why everybody has to pay lip service to them, because we have a fundamental need. Just as we have a need for love, just as we have a need for food, for water, for shelter, we have a fundamental need for community and for belonging. And so unless we create generous, inclusive communities where everyone is welcome regardless of origin, regardless of inclination, regardless of kind, everyone is welcome in that community, what we get instead is exclusive, very, very dangerous communities. And I'm basically talking about fascism. We are seeing the resurgence of fascism across the world. And what fascism is an exclusive community. It's a tribe which says, we stand together against those other people. And we will express our difference from them through our dominance over them. We will crush those people by standing together against them, and by becoming dominant, we express our solidarity with each other. If you don't create positive communities, negative communities will fill that gap. And as Hannah Arendt pointed out, fascism arises out of the shattering of society. It's the dust and powder of society out of which the dust devils of fascism arise. Because when people don't have a sense of belonging to a place, to each other, to themselves, they will go and belong to some bloody demagogue who stands up and makes impossible promises to them, which they will then follow. And that's why we see the resurgence of fascism today. So, how do we create genuine communities which are going to be inclusive, tolerant, kind, generous, which are going to allow a place for everyone, and yet I believe should also be geographically rooted? Because while you can form communities on the internet, you can form communities of interest which might span the world, I think we all also need place. That is a crucial element of belonging to us. Even if we're only in that place for a couple of years, we might be passing through, we still, while we're there, want to feel we belong to this place and to the people of this place, even if we come from a completely different place ourselves. I feel that sense of place is a crucial element of a true belonging, and has to be at the middle of the sort of core community which we might want to build. And I think there are two principal ways of getting into this. And I don't want to go on for too long, because I generally do. So I'll be quite brief about this. And the first one is creating a participatory culture. This is a sort of practitioner's term for it. And a participatory culture is in part things like this. Exactly the kind of project that we're looking at here, Galgale. It epitomizes one of the key elements of bringing people together, bringing them out of their homes where they might have been by themselves, facing what seemed to be impossible problems, dealing with those problems through drink or through other forms of dysfunctional responses, not having a place in society because there's no work, because everything's fallen apart. It has given people a place, a purpose, a sense of belonging, a community. And it's exactly this kind of project which is identified by practitioners the world over as being crucial to creating participatory cultures. But alongside very specific and engaged projects of this kind, you also need looser and lower commitment projects too, so that you have a high chance of involving a very large number of people who might be only able to dip in and out of things, who might have no skills at all, who might be a bit frightened by the idea of having to commit to doing a course, to doing a sort of long-term thing, to making a commitment, is what people call low threshold, low commitment activities. And a classic example of this is cooking and eating together. Something anyone can do, even if you've got no experience of cooking, you can help out and learn some skills in doing so. It can be a lot cheaper if you buy your food in bulk, etc. But it's absolutely crucial to community. Does anyone know the root of the word companion? Companes, with bread. It's a fundamental aspect of being together is eating together. Shared childcare, shared making and mending. There's a whole load of sort of low threshold, low commitment activities where you can just sort of go along once or twice and you don't have to think, oh God, they're going to pull me in like some cult or something and I'm going to be sucked in. You can just sort of just dip in and out a bit. And there's a very interesting study by Lambeth Borough Council in London, a 400-page study looking at examples all over the world and pulling out the best examples. And they say if you get this right with a combination of really sort of dense and involved projects like this one and the low commitment projects alongside them, you sort of start to bring these together, you can suddenly reach a tipping point where about 10% of the local population is involved in these projects, which coalesces into what they call thick networks. And a thick networked community is one in which suddenly it becomes the norm to be involved and it becomes abnormal not to be involved. And everybody just sees it as an ordinary part of daily life to participate in community activities. And a classic example of where this has happened is Rotterdam, which a bit like Glasgow is a place which has had a load of problems. You know, it's an old port city which has had a load of unemployment and urban dysfunction, very divided city in many ways, with districts where people don't talk to each other, where there's a lot of religious division and cultural division. And some people set up a little festival in a disused Turkish bathhouse, you know, it's a big sort of warehouse type space, a bit like this. And they, just for a week, a little festival where they did put on plays and theatre, and it was a hangout space. You could read, you could chat, you could have a drink. And it was so successful that a lot of the people who went said, well, why can't we have this all the time? So they kept it open and they kept it running. And out of that, people started setting up cafes and bars, and there was a nursery area, which then became a proper nursery. And there were, and they thought, oh, we could reach out to older people who might be isolated at home and bring them into this. And suddenly, it began to proliferate. And in the course of 6 years, into 1,300 projects. It has transformed the city. The whole city has basically been turned around by this. There's all these social enterprises, community enterprises, commercial enterprises spun off from this. People have got jobs. People are making money in the local economy once more. They don't have to head off to the other side of the city or to another city to find work. And there's a sense of coherence and belonging which there was not before. And it's been so successful that the City Council has been pulling in representatives from these community groups to say, you're obviously better at this stuff than we are, so we're going to ask you to tell us how we should be doing our jobs. And the whole political culture there has shifted. But that is only half the story. And the even more potent half of the story, essential as that first half is the transfer of genuine power and genuine resources to the community. This is where it gets really important. This is the stuff which we don't have yet and we desperately need. And now I believe we can have. And to introduce this side of it, I'd like to point out first that nearly all our political and economic debates take place on just one axis. And this axis is state on one end and market on the other. And if you're on the left, you say you want more state and less market. And if you're on the right, you say you want more market and less state. And all the arguments we have are basically along that axis. But in having those arguments, and in all the economics textbooks and in all the political discussions and stuff, we completely forget that there are actually four main sectors to the economy. There is the state and there is the market, and I'm not saying we should prohibit either of them, but there's also the household, the crucial element of the economy without which there wouldn't be any other economy. Because if children are not fed and watered, and not clothed and not loved and not taken to school, they're not going to be functional adults. They're not going to be able to participate in the economy at all. And because we constantly neglect the household, we undervalue the work of women, which still dominates within the household. And so we're constantly missing the fact that women sit at the core of the economy. You know, even those who aren't in formal jobs are absolutely crucial to the survival of everything else that we might do. And then there is element 4, the commons. Now, how many people would feel comfortable defining the commons? Thanks. 1.5, 2.5, 3.5. Yeah, not bad. Pretty good, actually. Not a bad average. It's remarkable, isn't it? This is one of the 4 main sectors of the economy, and no one, apart from the eminent exceptions, knows what it damn well is. It's an extraordinary thing we face here. And the reason why is that it is permanently neglected. Now, the commons was once the major component of the economy. Most things were once the commons, and I'll explain what the commons is. A commons is a resource which is controlled and run by a community for the benefit of that community. It's an inalienable resource, which means it can't be sold, it can't be given away, it can't be traded off. It exists in perpetuity, and the community manages it to ensure that it exists in perpetuity. And the product from that resource, whatever it might be, is shared on an equal basis among the members of the community. This is not the state, it's not the market. It's not a communist system, it's not a capitalist system either. It does not rely on growth, it relies on generating a steady well-being and prosperity which might or might not be monetized to the members of the community. And it is the crucial missing element in our economies and in our political thinking today. And to explain it further, I'm going to take one classic example of a resource which was once held in common almost everywhere, and I would like to see held in common a lot more today than it currently is, and that is the land. Now, once upon a time, nearly all the land was held in common. And then enclosures, mostly private, rich, powerful people, moved in and basically grabbed that land from the people who not only lived on it, but used it to supply all their needs and used it as a focus of their community lives, of their social lives. And when that land was enclosed and taken from those people and fenced off and no trespassing signs were put up around it, it wasn't just that people lost their livelihoods. They lost everything. They lost everything which gave them meaning and place and purpose in their lives. Now, I've worked with indigenous people on 3 continents, and I've seen this happening, this total psychic destruction that follows the loss of people's land, the complete internal and external collapse of their lives, and massive mental health problems, alcoholism, drug abuse, all the rest of it that follows that loss. So after 6 years working with those people, I came back to Britain, and sometime after I returned, I started reading the poems of John Clare. First, the nature poems. You know, in his early adulthood, he wrote these beautiful, amazing poems about the wildlife and the places where he lived, and about the people who lived in them, and the community and the ceremonies, the ceremonial life, which was critical to all this. And it's absolutely beautiful, amazing, rich, engrossing poems. And then in mid-adulthood, the enclosures came along, and they put up their fences and they threw everyone out off the land, and they put in their bloody sheep. The sheep, oh, no, I'm not going there. They basically replaced the people with sheep, just as happened up here with the Highland Clearances and the Lowland Clearances. You know, we always talk about the Highland Clearances, we forget about the Lowland Clearances, we forget about the enclosures in England as well and in Wales, and threw everyone off. Clare lost his mind, became an alcoholic. He ended up in a mental health asylum, a lunatic asylum as they called them then. And I realized suddenly, wait a minute, he's the people I've just been seeing. That's what happened to them. It's the same situation. And then I thought, wait a minute, if it happened to John Clare, it's happened to everybody. Especially as that model, which was developed first in England, was then pushed out in Ireland and then in Scotland and then exported to the colonies and spread all over the world. And I saw the results working with those indigenous people. If it's happened to them and happened to him, it's happened to all of us. And maybe that anomie and alienation and psychic rupture and collapse hasn't ended yet. Maybe we're still living with it. Maybe the huge problems that we face in our own lives are still governed by that terrible event that happened and the fact that we haven't yet been able to recreate that sense of belonging, that sense of place, that sense of community, that sense of knowing who you are by reference to where you are and the people around you. Not in an exclusive way. We don't have to do it in an exclusive way at all. We can do it on the basis of a generous, tolerant, inclusive community building. So what I want to see happening is the land returned to communities in the form of commons. Well, how on earth are we going to do that? I have a cunning plan. Number one, you need a sympathetic government. So regime change is required. I'll be coming on to that later. Regime change, of course, in an entirely democratic sense. But I will be moving on to that, how we're going to do that. And this government introduces the key element, as I see it, which is land value tax. This isn't such an outlandish idea. It's been talked about for centuries, well, for at least 1 and a bit centuries in this country. And going back further than that, actually, is Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations advocates a ground tax, as he called it, a land value tax. Winston Churchill, I mean, it comes up again and again and again, and it's not something which necessarily divides people on party lines. People just see the sense of it, partly because the reason the big landowners, I'm thinking primarily the urban landowners, the reason the big urban landowners are so rich, have such valuable property, is that we've made it valuable. By building the roads and the sewers and the hospitals and the schools and all the things, which make it a desirable location. And as you know, in property, it is location, 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 which makes the land valuable. And so they harvest the wealth that we have created and they put it all in their own pockets. They take it out of the community in the form of rent, basically. How many people here are paying extortionate rents? So you are probably working your asses off in order to pay money to people who don't have to work because you are doing the work for them. You are working so hard so that they can just sit there like a fish in the current with their mouth open, taking it all in. They don't have to do anything. They just sit on this land. Now, you might not perceive it as land, you perceive it as bricks and mortar, you perceive it as buildings that you're paying rent for. The primary element of the cost of those buildings is not the bricks and mortar, it's the land that underlies them. And we have created the value of that land. We should reclaim the value of that land. So in other words, those who above a certain threshold, and we're talking about the people who are making a lot of money, who have multiple properties, who have big pieces of urban land, we should be taxing that. And taxing it in such a way that it breaks the power of patrimonial capital. Just as after the Second World War, they broke the power of patrimonial capital with wealth taxes and income taxes, we should do it this time with land value tax. One of the great things about land value tax is you can't take your land away and put it in Panama. So what happens with land value? Well, one of the first things that happens is the price of the land comes right down because no longer is it a lucrative speculation because you're not taking all the profit. Most of the profit is now going elsewhere. The second thing that happens is that suddenly there's a big pool of money. What are you going to do with it? Well, some of it should go to the state and to local government to pay for essential services. But there should be a residue of this money, probably a significant amount, which is distributed among the communities of the nation. And those communities are encouraged to set up a trust into which that money is put. Now, because what you're doing in effect is creating a commons, originally around the money is your first commons in that case, it's going to be up to the members of the community to decide what to do with that money. But this more sympathetic state government that we're talking about bringing in, and we'll come to that as I say, might want to bring about one or two other mechanisms to encourage people to make good use of this money in ways which can really transform community life. One of them you already have in Scotland, now applied to urban areas as well as rural areas, community right to buy, a crucial element. We need, alongside that, I believe, community right to land assembly, which might include compulsory sales option. In order to be able to get coherent enough bits of land that you can actually do something useful with them. And I know this is sort of mooted in the Land Commission's first strategic report. It sort of hints at it. It's not totally explicit about it, but I'm told that there are now discussions going on within the Land Commission which could actually make this explicit. So, you know, Scotland is definitely a place where some of this stuff could happen. The trouble is, you know, without the communities having the money in the first place to buy the land, even at its reduced price, even if there is a reduced price, you can't get off the first base with this. You just, you know, you might have all these rights, but you don't have any economic power. This is why you need the money redistributed through land value tax, so that you actually have the economic power to go with it. And again, the Land Commission broadly hints about changing the taxation regime, which could be interpreted as land value tax. And again, I'm told that internally it's talking about land value tax. So you might, in Scotland, be some of the way there. I'd like to see this rolled out to the rest of the UK, incidentally, as well. So you have this community right to buy, community right to land assembly. And one thing a community might do is say, okay, what are our needs around here? Ooh, do we need that casino on the piece of land we've just bought? Probably not our most pressing need. What about affordable housing? And when I say affordable housing, I don't mean affordable housing, I mean affordable housing. How about that as a need our community might have, and, you know, which communities does not have this need? So, okay, we're going to knock the casino down. Now that we've bought this, you know, who needs it? And we're going to clear the site, and then we're going to say, right, let's say 50% of the people living on this are going to be people on the social housing list in urgent need of genuinely affordable housing. So we're going to take people from the top of the social housing list and say, you have a right to live here if you want. We're then going to say the other 50% can be split between owner-occupiers and people in the private rented market who are going to rent it from us. Everyone's going to rent it from us, but the owner-occupiers can buy the houses, if not the land, because the land is going to be held in common. You say, right, you guys who, you know, you've put down a deposit, people who want to be owner-occupiers, people who want to be private renters here, come together with these people from the social housing list, and you are going to design the estate. We'll provide some professional advice for you, so people can say, well, you know, here are all the different ways in which you could do it, but you're going to design this. And what we see again and again all over the world is that when people design their own housing developments, they are far, far better places to live than when some volume house builder comes along, plonks down their toy town houses, and then says, there you are, like it or lump it. And basically we have to lump it because we've got no choice about where we live most of the time. And you get far more child-friendly developments. How about that? Children built into developments. You know, children just don't feature in the planning system at all. There's no provision for them whatsoever, which is why all the public spaces are taken up by cars instead of by places where the children can play. You could have, for instance, a village green type development with the houses surrounding it, looking onto it so they can play safely because, you know, there's pairs of eyes, no cars on the inside, all the cars outside, you know, and children knit a community together. Anyway, you know, it's going to be up to you, the future residents on this site, how this site is going to be. And you, the future residents, are going to have to work together to design this thing. Oh, and by the way, you'll be designing your own homes on the site as well, to your own specifications. That's going to happen too. You know, there's going to be a budget, but, you know, wait for questions to the end, thanks. You're going to be doing this, but you're going to have to be working on this together. And what you find is that you create a community even before anyone moves on. People have been intensely engaged with each other in designing this site so that it works for everyone, so that by the time they're moved on, they all know each other well. You've got a ready-made community there, and the land is still in common ownership because your trust has now become a commons land trust. So then you say, okay, we're still getting money from the land tax. We're now getting a stream of revenue in the form of these reduced rents, but coming to us, to the Commons Trust, from this land with the housing on. What are we going to do with this money? So you could say, right, well, let's make some public amenities. You know, all the things that communities tend to be missing, community centres and sports centres and playgrounds and public toilets. Anyone remember those? These things which are missing. You can start to create public luxury. There's plenty of room for public luxury. There's no room for private luxury, for everyone to have private luxury. If everyone in Glasgow had their own tennis court and swimming pool and art gallery and play barn, Glasgow would cover all of Scotland, probably cover all of Britain. Some people's private luxury deprives other people of space, physical space, environmental space. There's not enough for everyone to live in private luxury, but there's enough for everyone to have public luxury. The model we should be pursuing is private sufficiency and public luxury. And so maybe the Commons Land Trust can start creating some public luxury. Okay, that's one thing we can do. But another thing they might do is to say, well, we've got this income stream, let's pay a basic income to everyone in the community. These are a few ideas of what we can do. And this is just one example of a commons that we could create, and there are many, many more that we could pursue. But for this to start off, we need a government that is sympathetic. And 2 might sound like a tall order, but I think that in decades to come, political historians are going to look back on the first half of 2016 as the inflection point at which politics changed. First half of 2016, you've got to be kidding. What possible good thing happened then? Well, it might seem strange, but it's the Bernie Sanders campaign. He lost. What are you talking about? He didn't even become the Democratic nominee, let alone the President of the United States. And sure, he started from this really inauspicious place. He had 3% name recognition, he had no money, he was dismissed by all the cognoscenti as being completely out there. And they sat down and said, well, what have we got? Well, the only thing we've got is the enthusiasm of the people who want Bernie Sanders to be president. So they said, well, okay, what if we start, because we can't pay any staff except for 1 or 2, what if we start giving volunteers some of the jobs that we, the staff, might do? Sorry, I'm overrunning, aren't I? Yeah, I won't be long. And so they tried it, and it worked. So they gave them a bit more, and they gave them a bit more, and suddenly they found that the volunteers were just as good at doing the jobs as the staff would have been. So they said, what if we use the first wave of volunteers to train the next wave of volunteers? They did that, and it worked. And basically, the Sanders campaign was one giant live experiment in what is now called big organising, getting large numbers of volunteers together to start rolling out a program which previously only staffers would do. And they only really cracked it about 4 weeks before the end, which is so frustrating because they got the model, they worked out how to do it, and then it was too late. But even so, he very nearly clinched it. They had 100,000 volunteers who had set up 100,000 events and spoken directly to to 75 million adults. Had they carried on another 4 weeks, they would have spoken to every accessible adult in America. They would have swept it, and they would have swept the presidency, I'm convinced of it. So I'd read a book by 2 of the people who ran that campaign, and when Theresa May announced the general election in this country, you remember when Jeremy Corbyn's opinion poll rating was minus 46%, there was a 26% voting intention for Labour. The only debate was, is the Tory majority going to be 100 or 120? I made this video for The Guardian where I said, you know, if Labour applied this technique, this big organising technique over here, it could just about do it, even though there's only 5 weeks to go. And the levels of mockery and vituperation were off the scale. There wasn't a single positive comment under this video. And I thought, oh, God, what have I done? What an idiot. I can't believe I said that. Oh, dear. We're talking about wishful thinking. Little did I know they'd already brought over, by the time I made that video, a couple of Sanders people, and they were working out how they were going to do it here. And we all know the result. The biggest political surprise in British democratic history. Just an extraordinary turnaround. And it was because the Labour governments, along with Momentum, used the big organising campaign, spoke to vast numbers of people directly and tipped it. This technique can be applied to any subject we want. It doesn't have to be for a general election. It can be for any campaign. This rolling, proliferating network of volunteers, the creation of a political community to pursue our wider politics of belonging. And it's my contention, my friends, that if we marry this new technique of creating political community through big organising with the new narrative, the new restoration story that lights a path to a better world, we will become unstoppable. Thank you.